When Mary Trump's book came out about her uncle, the president, a few weeks ago, you remember that book. It became an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. It sold like a gazillion copies even before it came out. And the book is a fairly terrifying up-close look at the president from the perspective of someone in his family who has known him since she was a little kid. And there's a lot in the book that was honestly sort of more flesh on the bones of stuff that we already had an inkling of when it comes to this president. Mary Trump provided new detail, for example, about alleged financial crimes by the president and tax fraud by the president. New detail about racist and sexist stuff from him. New detail about displays of cruelty from him over the course of his life. I mean, the book was full of alarming information. That's why it sold so widely. But I'll tell you, I'm reading it. What I felt reading it is that a lot of the worst stuff in the book, frankly, it did sort of fit the general contours of what we'd already come to learn about the president over his time in public life. It gave us more detail. It gave us further anecdotes that bolstered what we might have already known for a lot of the big stuff. That said, there were a few things in Mary Trump's book that stood out as absolutely new. And at least when I read the book for the first time, just disconnected from anything I had previously known about him, including this passage I want to share with you, a short passage from chapter 11 of Mary Trump's book. It's a scene where Mary and her brother, Fritz, are talking with their Uncle Robert. Their Uncle Robert is the president's brother who just recently died. And in this scene in the book, Mary and Fritz are talking with their Uncle Robert about money. About the money in the family. The president's father, the profoundly rich Fred Trump Sr., Mary and Fritz's grandfather, had just died, and Mary and her brother had learned that they were being basically cut out of the will, and they're having a conversation about it. And this is how Mary Trump relays that conversation. Quote, "At our first meeting, when we asked our Uncle Robert to explain why my grandfather had done what he had, he said, 'Listen, your grandfather didn't give a bleep about you. And not just you, he didn't give a bleep about any of his grandchildren. We're being treated worse because our father died,' I said." This is in Mary's voice. That's Mary talking. She says, quote, "When we pointed out that our cousins, who were also grandchildren of Fred, they would still benefit from the money their parents were getting, Uncle Robert said any of them could be disowned at any time. Donnie," meaning Donald Trump Jr., "was going to join the army or some bull bleep like that, and Donald and Ivana told him if he did, they would disown him in a second." That's from chapter 11 of Mary Trump's recent book about her uncle, the president. She says there was family discussion on this matter, that President Trump told his son, Don Jr., that he would be disowned from the Trump family if he committed the grave sin of enlisting in the U.S. military. And like I said, a lot in Mary Trump's book sort of fit the contours of what we already knew or suspected about this president and what he's like, but that did not. That stood out as a whole new idea, and I asked Mary Trump about it, and I'm about to show you a portion of my interview with Mary Trump on that subject that has never aired before. Watch. In terms of what Americans should take from this, I feel like you've defined some things in his upbringing that are psychologically interesting in terms of us figuring out who he is and why he might think the way that he did. But there's also some things that you describe that I think he would see as contrary to the public image that he has created. For example, there is an anecdote that you share in the book where you say that your cousin Donnie, Donald Trump Jr., had apparently at one point planned to or said he might enlist in the Army. And it was relayed to you that your uncle, the president, had told him that he would be disinherited if he enlisted?
Yeah, my Uncle Robert told me that story.
Do you think it's true, or did you ever have
I've had no corroboration, but I believe it. That there was literally no reason for him to make such a thing up. It's a pretty specific thing to lie about.
It's striking because your father has made a big deal out of the fact that he went to a military-themed boarding school. And you write about that decision within the family that he should go off to that school to sort of give him some discipline at some point, and it seems to have not really worked. But he has built that up as a sign of his respect for the military, his purported respect for the military. So the idea that he would go to a military-themed school and that would be a source of pride, but his son wanting to join the actual military would be a source of shame and would be something that should be punished. It's just quite a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, my uncle, not my dad. Yes, it is. There's a great disconnect. No problem. There's a real disconnect there. And then, Donald's later doing everything in his power, and my grandfather is doing everything in his power to make sure that Donald did not have to serve. So, I'm not entirely sure I know how to explain it.
I'm not entirely sure I know how to explain it, she says. What she's referring to there in terms of doing everything in their power to make sure that Donald didn't have to serve, that I think is a reference to the multiple deferments that President Trump got during the Vietnam era for supposedly having bone spurs in his feet, even though those didn't seem to bother any other aspect of his life, including his active athletic career. But Mary Trump, that's her talking about this anecdote that she discloses in her recent book, where she says it was discussed openly in her family that her uncle, President Trump, wouldn't allow his son to join the military upon pain of being disowned. And that, to me, reading Mary Trump's book was new, which is why I asked her about it. I did screw up in the way I asked her the question. I described the president's behavior as if that was her father. The president's obviously her uncle, not her father, so she had to correct me there. But that anecdote has kind of stuck with me because it seems strange. And I have since realized that it tracks with something else that's been reported from the president's life, something reported last summer by Gabriel Sherman at Vanity Fair. He reported that a source had passed to him what appears to be a copy of the president's prenup, a prenuptial agreement he signed with one of his wives, Marla Maples, before he agreed to marry her. This was after his first marriage to Ivana Trump, with whom he had Don Jr. and Eric and Ivanka. Before he married his second wife, Marla Maples, though, she had already given birth to their child, their daughter Tiffany. And I know, who cares? Like, I even hate talking about this stuff. But what is relevant here is that baby Tiffany was already on the scene when the president signed this prenuptial agreement with Marla Maples about what the financial settlement would be between them if their marriage didn't work out. And now, in retrospect, there is a part of that stands out as well, like the rocket's red glare. This is from Gabe Sherman's reporting last summer. Quote, "More than anything, the prenup shows how fiercely Trump wanted to protect the money he did have. Marla Maples reportedly wanted $25 million if the marriage failed, but Trump agreed to pay her only $1 million if they separated within 5 years, plus another $1 million to buy a house. The agreement also states that Trump's $100,000 child support payments for Tiffany would cease if Tiffany got a full-time job or enlisted in the military." Ms. Maples agreed to these terms with the hope that Trump would renegotiate a better deal in 5 years. He reportedly signed a legal document that would end child support payments to his youngest daughter, specifically if she joined the military. And per Mary Trump's book that came out this summer, that tracks pretty perfectly with family discussion over him threatening to disown his oldest son if he joined the military as well. And that history, of course, is, uncomfortable alongside the president's constant efforts to associate himself with the military and wanting military parades held in his honor and all the rest of it. But it's also just a little bit strange, right? Just as a human thing to do. I mean, parents, of course, worry about the safety of their son or daughter. If their son or daughter is going to sign up for the military and might end up going off to war, we all understand that. But we all also understand that military families on the whole are immensely proud of their sons and their daughters who serve. My dad's a vet. I'm hugely proud of him. My cousins are vets. I'm hugely proud of them and thankful for their service. Threatening your kids that they'll be cut off and no longer your kid if they enlist? It's just not a normal thing. I mean, especially for somebody who's so loud now and proclaiming how much he loves the military more than anybody else in the whole country. Well, now, tonight, the yuck factor here has come into piece by reporter Jeffrey Goldberg that is just published at The Atlantic. And it's something that, it's not gory, but it will turn your stomach. And it really does put the focus on something odd and curdled and wrong at the center of this. You see the headline here. Trump says, Americans who died in war are losers and suckers. Quote, when President Donald Trump canceled a visit to the Ain Marne American Cemetery and Memorial near Paris in 2018, he blamed rain for the last-minute decision, saying that the helicopter couldn't fly and that the Secret Service wouldn't drive him there. Neither claim was true. Trump rejected the idea of the visit to that American cemetery and memorial because he feared his hair would become disheveled in the rain, and because he did not believe it important to honor American war dead, according to 4 people with first-hand knowledge of the discussion that day. In a conversation with senior staff members on the morning of the scheduled visit, Trump said, quote, why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers. In a separate conversation on the same trip, Trump referred to the more than 1,800 U.S. Marines who lost their lives at Belleau Wood as, quote, suckers for getting killed. Belleau Wood is a consequential battle in American history, and the ground on which it was fought is venerated by the U.S. Marine Corps. America and its allies stopped the German advance toward Paris there in the spring of 1918 in World War I. But Trump, on that same trip, asked staffers, quote, who were the good guys in this war? He also said he didn't understand why the U.S. would intervene on the side of the Allies. So per Jeffrey Goldberg's reporting tonight in The Atlantic, that's the president telling staffers he doesn't know which side we should retroactively root for from World War I, the side with America on it or the German side. Again, this is the piece just published tonight in The Atlantic magazine. Reporter Jeffrey Goldberg saying he pursued this line of inquiry about the president's statements and feelings about the military, in part because the president never really paid a price for disparaging the family of a U.S. Army captain killed in Iraq, the family of Hamid Khan, and also he never really paid a price for saying this about Senator John McCain, who, whatever you think of his politics, inarguably is an American war hero for having been held for 5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam.
He's not a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic tonight says that he's been fascinated with the president's take on this matter because he didn't ever pay a political price for those strange comments and those strange attacks to make on American war hero and the family of an American war hero. Goldberg says tonight, quote, there was no precedent in American politics for the expression of this sort of contempt. But the performatively patriotic Trump did no damage to his candidacy by attacking McCain in this manner, nor did he set his campaign back by attacking the parents of Hamid Khan, an Army captain killed in Iraq in 2004. But Trump remained fixated on McCain. When McCain died in 2018, Trump told his senior staff, according to 3 sources with direct knowledge of this event, quote, we're not going to support that loser's funeral. He became furious, according to witnesses, when he saw flags lowered to half-staff. What the F are we doing that for? Guy was an effing loser, the president told staffers. Trump's understanding of heroism has not evolved since he became president. According to sources with knowledge of the president's views, he seems to genuinely not understand why Americans treat former prisoners of war with respect, nor does he understand why pilots who are shot down in combat are honored by the military. On at least 2 occasions since becoming president, according to 3 sources with direct knowledge of his views, President Trump referred to former President George H.W. Bush as a, quote, loser for being shot down by the Japanese as a Navy pilot in World War II. The former President Bush escaped capture, but 8 other men shot down during the same mission were caught, tortured, and executed by Japanese soldiers. President Trump's cynicism about service and heroism extends even to the World War I dead buried outside Paris, people who were killed more than a quarter century before he was born. President Trump finds the notion of military service difficult to understand, and the idea of volunteering to serve especially incomprehensible. On Memorial Day in 2017, Trump visited Arlington National Cemetery, a short drive from the White House. He was accompanied on this visit by John Kelly, who was then Secretary of Homeland Security, and who a short time later would be named a White House Chief of Staff. The 2 men, Trump and Kelly, were set to visit Section 60, the 14-acre area of Arlington that is the burial ground for those killed in America's most recent replacement wars. John Kelly's son, Robert, is buried in Section 60. A first lieutenant in the Marine Corps, Kelly was killed in 2010 in Afghanistan. He was 29 years old. And President Trump was meant on this visit to join John Kelly in paying respects at his son's grave and to comfort the families of other fallen service members. But according to sources with knowledge of the visit, Trump, while standing by Robert Kelly's grave, turned directly to Kelly's father and said, quote, "I don't get it. What was in it for them?" John Kelly, who declined to comment for this story, initially believed, people close to him said, that Trump was making a ham-handed reference to the selflessness of America's all-volunteer force. But later he came to realize that Trump simply does not understand non-transactional life choices. One of Kelly's friends, a retired four-star general, tells Goldberg, quote, "He can't fathom the idea of doing something for someone other than himself. He just thinks that anyone who does anything when there's no direct personal gain is a sucker. There's no money in serving the nation." Kelly's friend went on to say, quote, "Trump can't imagine anyone else's pain. That's why he would say this to the father of a fallen Marine on Memorial Day in the cemetery where he's buried." Goldberg says, quote, "I've asked numerous general officers over the past year for their analysis of Trump's seeming contempt for military service. They offer a number of explanations. Some of his cynicism is rooted in frustration, they say. Trump, unlike previous presidents, tends to believe that the military, like other departments of the federal government, is beholden only to him and not the Constitution. Many senior officers have expressed worry about Trump's understanding of the rules governing the use of armed forces." Another explanation is more quotidian. The president believes that nothing is worth doing without the promise of monetary payback, and that talented people who don't pursue riches are losers. According to eyewitnesses, after one White House briefing given by then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford, Trump turned to staffers and said, quote, "That guy is smart. Why did he join the military?" Yet another related explanation concerns what appears to be Trump's pathological fear of appearing to look like a sucker himself. His capacious definition of sucker includes those who lose their lives in service to their country, as well as those who are taken prisoner or are wounded in battle. One officer with first-hand knowledge of Trump's views said, quote, "He has a lot of fear." Several observers told me that Trump is deeply anxious about dying or being disfigured, and this worry manifests itself as disgust for those who have suffered. Trump recently claimed that he has received the bodies of slain service members many, many times, but in fact he's traveled to Dover Air Force Base, the transfer point for the remains of fallen service members, only 4 times since becoming president. Trump has been, for the duration of his presidency, fixated on staging military parades, but only of a certain sort. In a 2018 White House planning meeting for such an event, Trump asked his staff not to include wounded veterans, on grounds that spectators would feel uncomfortable in the presence of amputees. Quote, "No one wants to see that," he said. That's Jeffrey Goldberg writing in The Atlantic tonight. The White House has responded to the publication of this story by calling the story, quote, "false" and, quote, "a disgrace." They say, quote, "just another anonymously sourced story meant to tear down a commander-in-chief who loves our military," which is kind of what you'd expect from the White House for a story this bad. But Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic very quickly got some important backup here on his reporting. Veteran military affairs reporter James Laporta, who now writes for the Associated Press, posted this within 90 minutes of Jeffrey Goldberg's article going live, quote, "A senior Defense Department official I just spoke with confirmed this story by Jeffrey Goldberg in its entirety, especially the graphs about the late Senator John McCain and former Marine General John Kelly." That reporter, James Laporta, who says he has confirmed all of this reporting tonight, he joins us next, as does a combat veteran, former Air Force helicopter pilot who was shot down while serving in Afghanistan. She